The Institute of Directors in Southern Africa's 6th annual business update got underway in Johannesburg today. This year's event is being held under the theme Courageous Leadership Conversations. The aim is to give directors and senior executives in both the public and private sectors a clear sighted look at the opportunities and challenges that South Africa offers. Joining us now is a speaker at the conference, leading economist Azar Jammine, who's chief economist at Econometrix. Thanks so much for your time. Azar, I think your speech was something to do with the role of business in a globalized South Africa, and this is very topical at the moment. South Africa in April became a bona fide member of Brazil, Russia, India and China. It is the largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa and poised to really set the charge for the investment drive into the continent. Do the South Africans wear this mantle? Do they accept this kind of responsibility?
I think they accept this responsibility, but I'm not sure that they fully recognize what this responsibility entails. One gets a sense of a little bit of a complacency that we are the mightiest economic power in Africa, and therefore if we want to go into Africa, we just decide and we go into it, and that South Africa will be used as a base from which the investors will want to penetrate Africa. And my warning was that this may not be that easy, and that in fact South Africa seems to be dropping back in terms of its leadership of the rest of the African continent.
It's a very sensitive issue, this idea of South Africa being the natural leader of Africa purely because of the infrastructure and the economic value of the country. There is a sense that South Africa should see the competition, the rivalry that exists economically in Africa, and not just accept that it's a gateway into the rest of Africa. It should also be looking for opportunities, and it should also be contesting the terrain alongside Brazil, Russia and India, and that's not quite how they approach their economic.
No, that is exactly what I was suggesting by the complacency which exists, because Africa without doubt is opening up and is offering huge opportunities. The world's population is increasing inexorably, and the strain on the capacity of the earth to provide all the natural and agricultural resources is enormous, and Africa is the last bastion of untapped resources, and South Africa should be climbing in there really rapidly.
How would you respond to companies like MTN, Shoprite, Checkers, Massmart, who say, but we saw this a long time ago, and that's why we've opened so many new entities across the African continent?
Bully for them, and we see precisely how beneficial it has been for them, and they have become leaders. I just think that many other South African companies could be emulating them and have not done so. There's been a reluctance to really get one's feet too muddied in the African waters.
This week we've seen the Prime Minister of Turkey visiting South Africa, meeting with the leadership here. So you do get a sense that South Africa's leaders are starting to cast their net wider, look into new areas for opportunities. It's not the conventional go to Asia. They're looking into Central Europe, they're looking into Central Asia, into Latin America. Are they doing it fast enough?
I think that some companies are indeed doing it fast enough, and in part they're doing it because they are being restricted and regulated domestically, and therefore no longer seeing their growth potential being fully exploited within South Africa, so they are looking elsewhere, and one would hope that many more follow suit. And that can rebound to the benefit of South Africa, because the more South African companies go abroad, the more we get an interplay of technology, information and opportunities to and from the country.
Where are the competitive advantages of doing business in South Africa? You're saying some companies are withdrawing because of restrictive regulations. The labour issue has been a very topical one in South Africa. The need to have flexible labour laws, the need to improve on the skills of South African workers, that's a huge constraint.
Those are huge constraints. You've outlined them perfectly. The third constraint, as far as I'm concerned, is that there is just insufficient small business entrepreneurial activity in South Africa that gives it a vibrance. And more than anything, whereas in the rest of Africa, governments are opening up The prototype of a dictatorial African regime raping its economy is passé. That's history. You are now finding more and more African countries moving towards a more democratic dispensation, freeing up their economies, encouraging business activity, and trying to entice businesses to exploit the opportunities. In South Africa, the government seems to view business almost as an enemy in many instances, and is making life very difficult for a lot of businesses as a result.
The paradigm shift that's needed, the good and the bad, government obviously needs to change its attitude, business needs to be a little more forthright. Where do you go when you're a saturated economy like South Africa, where the infrastructure exists? The people, although we've got social inequalities, have a certain level of purchasing power. The consumer is au fait with their rights and abilities.
Lerato, I don't think we've even begun to realize the enormous potential that could be unleashed in this economy if we did really educate the people and enable them to become more employable, and if we adjusted the labor market environment to make it more attractive for businesses to take on workers and for people to set up job opportunities for themselves by themselves rather than to rely on government getting a handout. This country has incredible potential, and we complain about there being a lack of skills and not enough skilled people, and the unskilled people are not finding jobs. But there is at least a key core of skills in this country that most other African countries do not possess. Let's use them. Let's exploit those skills.
Okay, so that's what's needed to promote local investment. Finally, how can we continue to entice investors to come into this market? The avenues seem to be the very sophisticated capital markets, investors buying into equities, or more importantly now, into South African bonds and treasuries. What's another way of getting investments to flow, and even local investors to use these particular platforms? Because there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. FDI figures suggest that FDI has dropped above 70% in the last couple of years. That's a worrying figure. But those who invest in ways in which we don't, as ordinary citizens, see the money tangibly on the ground.
First of all, I would not denigrate the fact that the flow of money coming into the country, I think even though it goes into equities and bonds and it's often seen as hot money, I think there are benefits to that. Ironically, the very flexibility of the rand and its volatility, it comes to our rescue at times like this when the world economy is slowing. The rand is suddenly falling and making a lot of our goods more competitive. But I really think we have to address the whole issue of government creating a more enabling environment for the business community instead of standing on it and threatening left, right and center, we are going to make life more difficult for you if you don't obey the rules that we are putting down.
Yeah, okay. On that note, let me thank you, Dr. Azar Jammine, who's an economist at Econometrix. He also gave a talk earlier on today at the Institute for Directors of Southern Africa on the role of business in a globalized world.